Arcade Heroes.
On June 11th, 1982, E.T. the Extraterrestrial came out to theaters and instantly became a cultural phenomenon. If you grew up in the 80s, then you saw E.T. at some point. Even if it wasn't in theaters, you probably saw it on VHS or on TV one Saturday afternoon or something like that. It was one of those inescapable movies whose influence was quite profound, and of course it generated a lot of clone movies, most of which weren't very good. But of course it also generated an infamous video game, which would be E.T. the Extraterrestrial on the Atari 2600. Now this game, this cartridge that I have here, no, this is not from the New Mexico desert. This is an original. This was the one that I grew up playing, and it's always been a bit exaggerated as to this being the worst video game ever. It's not. There are actually worse games than this one that have come out over the years, including worse ones on the Atari 2600 itself. But everybody knows the story behind this game and the infamous burial of many of the cartridges in the New Mexico desert. But did you know that Atari was working on an arcade and a pinball version? Well, that's what I'm going to get into today and provide a little bit of information and insight that I've recently discovered about those two versions. And so let's get into what I found out. So before really diving into this, I want to thank Dennis Harper for much of the information. He's the designer of games like Return of the Jedi, Toobin, Hydra, and Primal Rage. He was there during E.T.'s development process, and even though he wasn't on the team for it, he was able to provide some additional info that I'm going to be sharing with you today. Just let me preface all this with, no, I did not find a ROM, and there are no existing screenshots of the game either, and so unfortunately all that seems to have been lost to time. But who knows, sometimes prototypes show up in weird places. Just Marble Madness 2 is one that just hit MAME recently and has been causing some controversy for some reason. But either way, there may be a chance that it'll show up one day. But until then, here's some of the information that I have. Now, I do need to backtrack a little bit and say, well, let's say it's 1982, and Atari's just secured the biggest licensing deal of their history to that point on what was the biggest film of that year. Now, Atari had already found enormous success through licenses up to this point, particularly with Space Invaders and Pac-Man for both the Atari 2600 and their new 5200 game console. But we have to keep in mind, Atari was much more than consoles. They were the biggest video game company in the world, and they were still an arcade company at heart, as all of their biggest hits, such as Asteroids and Centipede, originated from the coin-op division. They're also making a strong play for the home computer scene with their 400 and 800 line of PCs. A lot of people forget that there was another E.T. game that they released for the Atari 800 called E.T. Phone Home, and it didn't have all those annoying pits that like the 2600 version. It even had a voice from E.T. And in that one you played as Elliot instead of E.T. But it's one of those games forgotten by time since it didn't really move the needle like Atari needed it to either. So what about the arcade side? Well, this was such a big licensing deal that Atari commissioned both a video arcade and a pinball version for E.T., and both of the games were assigned to one Robin Ziegler. Although I've had little success in reaching out to him, as there's very little info on him that I can find. I only found something about sailing, I think it was, in California, and that was years ago, but no contact information. Either way, talking with Dennis and another ex-Atarian, Rich Adams, they both confirmed that Robin was given the task to do E.T. for those two platforms, but he didn't have to worry about the same time stipulations that Howard Scott Warshaw had in place for the 2600 version. And so Howard only had 5 weeks, while Robin had the normal 18 to 24 month development window to work with. Now, it isn't clear which version that Robin was working on as far as which one progressed the quickest, although I have a hunch it was possibly the pinball machine, so let's take a look at that for a moment. Now, Atari had been involved in creating pinball machines between 1976 through 79, with Steve Ritchie's Superman being their last release. Some pinball concepts have been prototyped after that, but thanks to the new ET deal, someone decided that they should do a pinball table for it. Again, probably because it was such a huge licensing deal, it was a all hands on deck sort of thing. Now, unfortunately, no photos have ever been discovered of the ET pinball machine either. However, Atari decided at some point when they canceled ET, they kept the concept and renamed it to 4x4, and there are pictures of that. There is a prototype of that. And so it was never released either, but it's very likely that the elements from the original ET design, if not the entire playfield layout, were preserved. And one thing I could guess on this is that the 8 kinetic ball targets were intended to be pieces of ET's makeshift phone, so players would have to hit those once or maybe several times in order to collect every piece to progress through the game. And who knows, maybe it also would have had speech from the movie, but we'll never know for sure. Another interesting fact is that this wasn't the only pinball design created for ET. Over at Bally, the then kings of pinball, they designed their own ET layout, but once they found out that Atari had already secured those rights, they remade the table as BMX. Of course, it's always possible that one day we could still see an ET pinball machine, since pinball makers often create themes based on old movies that may not be relevant right at the moment, and so that just doesn't seem to matter so much with pins for whatever reason. Now on to the video side. Things had progressed to the point where a working playable version of the game did exist, and Dennis told me that the game was running on Atari's Pixie board, which is the same hardware that he used to design Return of the Jedi, and this is one reason why he can remember E.T. is because his game that he was working on was the only other one that was using this hardware. Now, there's not a lot of information on Pixie out there. If you go to system16.com, it does not mention it. It mentions some hardware configuration for Return of the Jedi, but it doesn't mention a Pixie board. As Dennis explained it, quote, Lyle Raines, early Atari technician, then engineer, then engineering manager, designed a graphics chip that could store images using about 4 times less memory than standard resolution pixel graphics. He used what he called pixel averaging. Images would be stored in an 8x8 block. Sorry for the keyboard art, but this is supposed to be a creeper. The 8x8 would be blown up to 16x16 with gaps between the pixels. Then the gaps would be filled using averaged color from adjacent pixels, both horizontally and vertically. This isn't perfect, but I hope you get the idea. What the real pain was is that it did not do color averaging. Back in those days, pixels were just numbers that looked up a color in the 256 entry color table. Okay, so the programmer, me, had to manually fill in a 256 by 256 table with colors that were the averages of the colors in the color table. Gah! And worse, as you can see by my crude drawing, sometimes a color would average nicely horizontally, but not vertically, so you had to try over and over. I literally spent days, weeks, months, defining the average color table. Then the artist would change the graphics, and I'd have to do it all again. It could only be used for the playfield graphics, not motion objects, and the results, in my opinion, were kind of crappy. Everything had a blocky, pixelated look to it. All the squarish artifacts you see in the playfield are due to the Pixie chip. Hey, you gotta save a buck, huh? End quote. So Dennis also explained that both E.T. and Return of the Jedi started development at about the same time, which would have been, again, the end of 1982. And it took him 18 months to complete Return of the Jedi, and he had a hard deadline due to the movie release. And he's also one that confirmed that back in those days, 18 months was the average development time at Atari, but he did mention that some would take up to 24. Now, because of them sharing the same hardware, it means that they would have a similar overall look in terms of pixel appearance and color. That said, I asked him if it was also going to be an isometric game, to which he replied, Jedi was always going to be isometric like Zaxxon. If I recall, and it is a bit fuzzy, E.T. was not really isometric like Jedi. It did not scroll diagonally. It scrolled horizontally, and the playfield was designed to look isometric, kind of like the original Sims game, end quote. He doesn't recall much about the gameplay other than to emphasize that it looked a lot like Return of the Jedi, so I'll use this line from System 16, which says, "You wandered around dodging NASA bad guys and collecting pieces to phone home." Now, I also asked Dennis about the cabinet. He did state, "I never saw one. It was canned before it got to that point, I believe. In those days, we didn't see a cabinet until just months before production." Now, one reason why E.T. would have been canceled is because 1983 was a very, very bad year for Atari. They had what you could probably call a brain drain, where if people weren't quitting or were fired, they were getting laid off in huge numbers, and the company was losing tons and tons of money. Atari, or Warner, who owned Atari, also fired Ray Kassar in the middle of the year and then rehired him back and called it kind of that he quit or something like that. But the ship was kind of rudderless, and so it was a bit of a chaotic situation. And so I'm sure that within all that, they looked at how the 2600 version had done and decided to just can it, and that's why it never seemed to get far enough for us to get some playable stuff on it. But as far as the cabinet goes, we can extrapolate, using some logic, what the cabinet most likely would have looked like. Now, had it not been canceled, it probably would have hit the market at the end of 1983 or the beginning of 1984, just, again, based on the 18-month window starting sometime at the end of 1982. Now, in the first half of 1983, Atari used a number of upright design variations, sometimes making special cuts in the wood like you see with Food Fight, or draping the cabinet in art like they did with both Star Wars and Crystal Castles. But that year, again, was very brutal for the company, and so by the latter half of the year, they didn't release very much, and their designs became more economical, which were mostly the same one to another, excepting Pole Position 2. Now, the cabinet design I think that they might have went with is the one introduced with Major Havoc, which was subsequently used with Firefox and iRobot in 1984. Major Havoc was released in November 1983. Now, apart from that timing, I also think that the shape of the cabinet is interesting. One thing to note is that when Brian Collin designed the cabinet for Xenophobe in 1987, he said that he was inspired directly by E.T.'s general shape, hence the long neck on that particular cabinet. Now, while the Major Havoc design doesn't have a neck, if you look at the general shape, it's kind of like you're looking at an alien with a big head, kind of like E.T.'s. And so perhaps that cabinet was designed in a way to represent E.T. himself, but since the game got scrapped, they just decided to keep the game design because it looked futuristic enough. Of course, this is all conjecture on my part. This mock-up that you've been seeing here, I based off of the iRobot design, but this wasn't sent to me by anybody. It was just something that I threw together in GIMP. But I like to think that that's pretty close to what we might have seen with the E.T. release. Of course, then again, it's possible that had they finished the game and it got to testing, it could have failed testing and been canceled anyways. But generally speaking, if a game reached test, there is usually some sort of existing ROM out there, so that would have been better for preservation's sake. Let me know what you think. Do you think that the E.T. arcade game, had it been released, would have been good? Something that would have been a classic worthy of being remembered? Personally, I don't know if it really would have, because, again, the gut reaction that everybody at Atari had when they heard that they had to do a video game on this was, well, this movie, while it was great as a movie, it wasn't great as a video game. They couldn't really think of a great concept to do a proper E.T. game, and so it's hard to say if it really would have worked out. But, they at least were giving it a shot, and I definitely don't blame Howard Scott Warshaw for how the 2600 version turned out. I think that was a miracle. It was quite an achievement that he was able to come up with anything playable like that in 5 weeks. And as a kid, I didn't really think it was that bad of a game. No, it wasn't my favorite game on the 2600, but I played it many times and I beat it, and I was able to even discover the little Easter eggs in it, like finding Yar in there. And so it wasn't the best game ever, but it definitely wasn't the worst. But let me know what you think, and also stay tuned for a special 50th anniversary video to celebrate Atari, since their 50th anniversary again is coming up at the end of this month. And if there's anything else Atari related that you'd like to see me talk about, I'll be happy to do so. In fact, I'm getting 2 arcade machines from Mr. Harper, so I'm very thankful for that. Turned out that he had a couple of those machines that he worked on, Toobin and Hydra, that he wanted to sell, and so I've grabbed them from him, and so I'll have those soon, and I'll probably do a video about maybe unpacking those and setting them up. But again, as always, thanks for watching. We'll catch you on in the next video.